Welcome back. Thank you for joining #apathy as we continue to look at the parallels between emotional wounds and physical wounds. Today, we're going to look at stage 2 of the healing process, which is called proliferation. Let's go ahead and take a look now. Again, stage 2 is called proliferation. And this is the stage after you've been wounded, the immediate things have taken place, and now it's time to deal with that wound. This is the process stage. Physically, proliferation parallels what it looks like when you have been wounded emotionally and you're receiving some type of support. When I say therapeutic support here, I am not a licensed therapist. I am not giving medical advice, but therapeutic support can also come from friends, family members. Sometimes it's individualized, it's you with God and prayer, or a good study Bible or devotional as you work through your healing. And God will place, if you pray for that, God will place kind, good people who have maybe shared in your emotional trauma, and you can work through these things with them. So therapy doesn't necessarily mean always that you have a paid therapist or that you're going to a meeting at a certain time, but that's also definitely important. And if available to you, I think that you should always find a good Christian Bible-based therapist. But that does not necessarily mean that you have to, and that's not what I'm always talking about in these slides. Let's move on. All right, let's talk about the healthy healing steps in stage 2. In a physical wound, what happens is new tissue is formed and secretes fluids. Emotionally, that should be you are in a place of safety where that emotional wound is no longer taking place. You are not still being newly and freshly wounded. You have supportive people and you have some guide of encouragement around you, whether that is Bible based time, that is prayer, whether you're attending a church service regularly. You have people around you who are pouring good things, new tissue, secreting good fluids into your life. That new tissue helps new blood vessels develop. What does that look like emotionally? Well, you are taking on a supportive perspective yourself. You are self supportive. You are looking toward your healing in a positive manner. That will provide a pathway to healing. Your perspective, our mindsets are 100% of how we see the world. And that does not mean that your pain was not tragic and horrible and true, but my perspective is that I am healing and not that I am festering. Now, what else is taking place? Damaged cells become helper cells that help healing continue. So, damaged cells, that area that was wounded, can now become a helper to help continue healing. And what that may look like in this instance is not that you are using your hurt to heal your hurt, but people around you who have been wounded as well. Those therapeutic group discussions where people are using the hurt that they have suffered and overcome to help others in their healing journey. So those are new cells, people who have been wounded and are healing and are able to help you progress along your healing journey. What does it look like during this proliferation stage? Well, you have a wound, and that wound has to be cared for, just like in the physical sense. The process in which you care for a wound, the order in which it's taken care of and cleaned, the areas that are actually touched and not touched, the utensils. What are you using to help heal this wound? Whether it's emotional or physical, those are very, very important. And the key requirements, nurses that worked with me during this study say that stability and bandaging are key care requirements. So, keeping that wound stable so that it is not continuing to be harmed, as we talked about before. So, I am out of that situation. I have removed myself physically or emotionally from that pain. And now the bandaging, the caring for that wound, the protecting it, the cleaning it. It is important to note that ignoring an emotional trauma produces the same spiritual results that ignoring a physical trauma would cause your body. If you're wounded in your body and you ignore it, it gets worse. Let's move on. So, there is a process that nurses share with me called debridement. And to keep it simple, debridement is removing damaged tissue or foreign objects from a wound. Well, wait a minute. That sounds super, super physical. What are we talking about emotionally when we say we're removing damaged tissue or foreign objects from our emotional wounds? Well, emotional debridement, there's two types. Type 1 is it's necessary to remove those misguided fears, those things that we think will happen. Oh my God, I can't touch this. This is just too much for me. Misplaced anger, where you're angry at all men because of a negative relationship with a man, or you don't like people who look a certain way because your attacker or abuser looked that way, or even self-blame. Self-blame can often show up in our lives. So emotional debridement is removing those things, those irrational fears of things around you or people, or those ways that you see people, or even the way you see yourself. Type 2 is further along in the process. And it often is very, very challenging. This is the work of the traumatized individual, ourselves, to remove or separate the abuse from the person who committed the abuse. And this is where we get into forgiveness. Forgiveness is central to our wound healing, and we will talk a lot about that, much more in the future. But right now, we start to look at emotional debridement. And as you might imagine, debridement is painful. Think of a wound or a scar, and you have to now pick at that scar and remove things from that huge wound on your leg, or there's some objects stuck in it and they've got to use equipment. It's best to use surgical equipment, right, to pull out those objects. You don't want to go poking around there with your fingers. And so this is a very sensitive area. It is not easy to do, but it is something that must take place for full maturation of healing to begin. In forgiveness, it's important to remember or to remove the title abuser. We must separate the two for true and lasting healing to occur. And that is much, much more tied to forgiveness, which we will talk about later. Now, sometimes unconventional methods must be used for healing to fully take place. And what you might not know is that salt water heals wounds. This is because salt water helps to clean and promote healing by a process called osmosis. Salt, sodium chloride, forces the liquid in cells to move out of the body when it comes in contact with them. If there is bacteria in those liquids, it is forced out too, helping to cleanse the wound. So you have a wound that will be healed by something that causes it pain. In our emotional sense, we are saying that salt is the truth. We are equating salt to truth when it comes to our emotional wounds. Remember that. And that bacteria, what that truth is removing from our body, is denial and conflicts that we've held on to avoid the pain of truth. Denial is a huge, huge problem for so many of us in our healing journeys because it is like an aspirin. It numbs us. We don't even have to deal with the pain at all. But if we are not dealing with the pain, if we are not dealing with the wound, we are also not healing the wound. Now, let's talk a little bit more about saltwater healing properties. If you take a look at our previous video, 12 verses that we shared that support God's revelation on this way of healing, these three parallels of healing, you'll know that we use 2 Kings 2, chapters 19 through 22, and we actually use those verses twice. So in those verses, Elisha adds salt water to heal it. The land he visits has potential to be full and lush, but it's unproductive. These are the areas of a wound that are often hidden even from ourselves. This is where salt is needed, the very thing that we don't want near our wound because it hurts terribly and, in fact, is seen as a torture. Throwing salt on the wound will intensify the pain, but the salt will also drive out the dirt. Salt, or truth, will remove the shame and denial, which can kill your potential if left untreated. Let's look a little bit more at salt being explained in this chart. Salt is bitter. The truth is also hard to take, but must be confronted and not necessarily publicly. The Bible talks about sharing with one person something that's very hard to share. And I can attest that sometimes when we make our heart up to share something that's very hard to share, our healing begins right now, right then. All right. Salt is drying, it dries things out. On the emotional side, it forces out those feelings of denial and other placeholders like fear and anger, which are just easier emotions than hurt, shame, and those types of pain. Then we have another property of salt. It seasons or brings out the taste. It amplifies taste. Well, truth, confrontation of the truth makes the pain real and it gets rid of all denial. So this is real. This is really happening. I know that this pain is here. It's up front. And so salt or truth will do that. Confrontation does not mean that we are um, reaching out to another person. This is intro confrontation, confronting myself on a matter. Okay. Salt preserves. Salt preserves. That means it keeps things from spoiling or going bad, keeps them alive and fresh. Confrontation, self confrontation, dealing with the truth keeps you from dying in your pain. And oftentimes that's a hidden thing that you are so much less productive in your life because you haven't been dealing with those hidden wounds. And then we have salt ruins things. Too much salt can make something unsavory, untasteworthy. You have to throw it out. And so in this case, too much focus on the painful truth can also kill. We don't want to stew in that pain. We want to confront it. We want to deal with it. We want to be honest with ourselves. We want to be able to share that with a positive, good, salt filled person. But we do not want to constantly live in that all the time. That's not something that should be our daily conversation for the next 5 years. All right. That will ruin you just as much as it could have helped you if you'd only used a little bit. Now, I'm sure that there are questions about forgiveness and what do you mean about removing an abuser from the abuse? Oh, we are going to get into that. I recommend the movie The Shack and specifically the clip here that's called Understanding Forgiveness. And of course, I could play that for you now. Um, you can also pull that up on YouTube as well. But I definitely recommend this clip where this man is practicing forgiveness every second, going through a tumultuous time and a horrible ordeal. But forgiveness is taking place. It's not easy, but it happens. Remember, any questions you have about forgiveness, please drop those in the comments or email us at #apathy@gmail.com, and we will get back to you as soon as possible because I know that there are some specific questions that people have. So please go ahead and send that private email. Remember, this is an individualized program. You are not necessary, you don't have to share this with anyone. This is just you and the materials getting what you need. All right, let's see what we have next. Forgiveness is a process. It is a repetitive exercise. That means we have to repeat it, exercise more than once for it to be useful, which forms a pattern. The pattern forms a habit of creating healthy and safe thoughts. These thoughts develop into healing. Read that again. Forgiveness is a process, a repetitive exercise, which forms a pattern. The pattern forms a habit of creating healthy and safe thoughts. These thoughts develop into healing. So, what do we know? Let's go over these 3 facts that we've learned so far. 1, untreated emotional wounds show up in the body. They show up as sickness, as illness. Number 2, untreated emotional wounds show up in the behavior of the wounded person. Oftentimes, this is self-medication. I call them sleeping pills or sleeping sticks that people smoke or sleeping potions that people drink because it keeps you asleep to your wounds. You might know those things as alcohol, tobacco, uh, opioids, but they are just ways to stay asleep to your problems, and they ruin us, and we know that. And so if we're aware of that and we get healing, we can move on past those. It's not as if you're lost if you have used those, but we know what they are and we're honest with ourselves about it. And then number 3, untreated emotional wounds have a cyclical effect in families and communities. And cyclical is a word that means the cycle. Things continue. An untreated wound that affects your body, that affects your behavior, will affect the people around you. A mother's untreated wounds affecting her behavior can create emotional wounds in a child. That child's emotional wounds can affect their body, and their emotions will then affect their behavior. And we continue the cycle. And so healing stops that cycle. Take it from me. So our next stage will be maturation, as you can see. But these are the 3 things we know. Remember to like, add, subscribe, share, put comments, send an email if you have a private comment or question, and we will get back to you ASAP. Thank you for joining.